The morning mist hung low over the palace gardens as Thomas Parker, head of the Royal Guard, made his routine inspection of the East Wing. Something felt different today. After 23 years of service, he had developed an instinct for trouble, and his gut was telling him to pay attention. Thomas had started his career as a young man fresh out of military training, dreaming of serving the crown. He never imagined he would one day be responsible for protecting secrets that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. The late queen had been gone for over a year now, but her presence still lingered in every corner of the palace. As he walked through the ornate hallways, Thomas noticed unusual activity near the private quarters that once belonged to Queen Camilla's son, Prince Edward. Staff members were whispering in hushed tones, and there was an energy in the air that made him uncomfortable. Edward had always been the rebellious one among the royal children, constantly finding himself in situations that required careful handling by the palace's public relations team. The prince had a reputation for expensive tastes and questionable friends. His gambling habits were well known among the inner circle, though carefully hidden from the public eye. Thomas had witnessed several late-night meetings where large sums of money changed hands, and he had always wondered where Edward got his seemingly endless supply of cash. Today, however, something was different. Thomas received an urgent call from Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell of the Metropolitan Police. She had been investigating a series of high-end jewelry thefts across London, and her investigation had led to some disturbing discoveries. Sarah had been working this case for months, following a trail of stolen goods that seemed to disappear into thin air. The detective had traced several pieces of extremely valuable jewelry to an underground network of dealers who specialized in items that were too hot to handle through normal channels. What caught her attention was that these weren't ordinary stolen goods. These pieces matched descriptions of items that should have been safely locked away in the royal vaults. Sarah's investigation had revealed that someone with intimate knowledge of the palace's security systems was involved. The thefts were too precise, too well planned to be the work of ordinary criminals. Someone on the inside was providing information. Or worse, someone on the inside was actually taking the items themselves. When Sarah contacted Thomas, she shared her suspicions about Prince Edward. She had evidence placing him at several locations where stolen jewelry had later surfaced. Credit card records showed him making purchases at exclusive shops known for their discretion and willingness to ask few questions about the origin of valuable items brought to them for sale. Thomas felt his stomach drop as he listened to Sarah's findings. If Prince Edward was involved in stealing jewelry, and if that jewelry belonged to the royal collection, this would be a scandal beyond anything the monarchy had faced in recent memory. The thought of Queen Camilla's son betraying the crown in such a way was almost too terrible to consider. The detective arranged to meet Thomas at the palace that afternoon. She would need access to the royal vaults to verify her suspicions, and she would need Thomas's help to conduct a thorough investigation without alerting the media or causing panic among the palace staff. As Thomas prepared for Sarah's arrival, he couldn't help but think about the late queen and how devastated she would have been by these allegations. She had always tried to guide Edward toward a more responsible path, but her influence had seemed to diminish as he grew older and more defiant. The palace corridors that had once felt like home now felt like a maze of secrets and potential scandals. Thomas knew that by the end of the day, his life and the life of everyone connected to the royal family might be forever changed. The investigation was about to begin, and there would be no turning back once the truth started to emerge. Thomas checked his watch and prepared himself for what might be the most difficult day of his career. The monarchy's reputation hung in the balance, and he was about to play a crucial role in either protecting it or watching it crumble under the weight of an unthinkable betrayal. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell arrived at the palace precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that would change everything. Thomas met her at the private entrance, away from the prying eyes of tourists and media who constantly surrounded the main gates. Sarah was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that had made her one of London's most respected investigators. As they walked through the palace's security checkpoints, Sarah explained the extent of her investigation. Over the past 6 months, she had been tracking a sophisticated network of jewelry thieves who specialized in extremely high-value pieces. What made this case unusual was the quality and rarity of the stolen items. These weren't ordinary diamond rings or gold necklaces that could be easily replaced. The stolen pieces included an emerald necklace that had belonged to a Russian duchess, a set of diamond earrings with a provenance dating back to the French Revolution, and most concerning of all, a sapphire brooch that matched the description of one that should have been in the royal collection. Sarah had photographs of these items taken at various underground auctions and private sales across Europe. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the photographs. He recognized several of the pieces from his own tours of the royal vaults. The sapphire brooch in particular had been one of the late Queen's favorite pieces, something she had worn to state dinners and important ceremonies. Seeing it in a police evidence file felt like a violation of everything he had sworn to protect. Sarah's investigation had revealed that Prince Edward had been present at several events where these stolen items had later appeared for sale. Security camera footage from exclusive hotels and private clubs showed him meeting with known dealers in stolen goods. Bank records indicated large cash deposits into his personal accounts that coincided with the dates when various pieces of jewelry had gone missing from their legitimate owners. The detective had also discovered that Edward had been living far beyond his official royal allowance. His lifestyle included expensive cars, luxury vacations, and gambling debts that reached into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. The mathematics simply didn't add up unless he had access to additional sources of income that weren't being reported to the palace's Financial Oversight Committee. Thomas led Sarah to the entrance of the royal vaults, a heavily secured area deep beneath the palace where the crown's most precious possessions were stored. As the head of the royal guard, Thomas was one of only 5 people who had unrestricted access to this area. The vaults contained not only official state jewelry, but also personal collections that had been accumulated by the royal family over centuries. The security system for the vaults was state-of-the-art, requiring multiple forms of identification including fingerprint scans, retinal recognition, and a complex series of codes that were changed monthly. Thomas had always taken pride in the fact that nothing had ever gone missing from the vaults during his tenure as head of security. As they descended the stairs toward the vault level, Sarah asked Thomas about Edward's access to these areas. Thomas explained that as a member of the royal family, Edward had legitimate reasons to visit the vaults occasionally, particularly when preparing for state functions or family ceremonies, where specific pieces might be required for traditional purposes. However, Thomas was beginning to realize that Edward's access might have been more extensive than anyone had realized. As a prince, Edward could request to see specific pieces for various reasons, and the vault staff would have little choice but to comply with his requests. The system had been designed to prevent outside theft, not to monitor the activities of family members who had legitimate reasons to be there. When they reached the vault doors, Thomas input his security codes with hands that were slightly trembling. He had conducted hundreds of routine inspections over the years, but this felt completely different. Today he wasn't just checking the security of the vaults. He was potentially about to uncover evidence that would destroy a family and shake the foundations of the monarchy. The massive steel doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing the climate-controlled environment where millions of pounds worth of jewelry, artwork, and historical artifacts were stored. The sight that greeted them was exactly what Thomas had feared. Several display cases that should have contained specific pieces were empty, and the inventory logs showed discrepancies that had somehow been overlooked during routine checks. Sarah immediately began photographing the empty cases and comparing them with her evidence files. The matches were undeniable. Pieces that should have been safely locked away in the royal vaults were appearing in her investigation into London's underground jewelry trade. The connection between Prince Edward and the missing items was becoming impossible to ignore. Thomas realized that his worst fears were about to be confirmed. The crown jewels themselves might be at risk, and the person responsible was someone he had sworn to protect. The evidence was overwhelming. As Thomas and Sarah continued their examination of the royal vaults, they discovered that at least 12 precious items were missing from their designated locations. Each missing piece corresponded exactly with items that had appeared in Sarah's investigation of the London jewelry theft ring. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Sarah carefully documented each empty display case while Thomas checked the security logs on his tablet. The electronic records showed that Prince Edward had visited the vault 7 times in the past 4 months, always during hours when minimal staff would be present. Each visit had been logged as routine inspection or preparation for upcoming ceremonial events, requests that would never be questioned when coming from a member of the royal family. Thomas felt physically sick as he realized how the thefts had been accomplished. Edward's royal status had given him the perfect cover. No security guard would dare to search a prince or question his activities in areas where he had legitimate access. The very system designed to protect the crown's treasures had been used against them by someone who understood exactly how to exploit its weaknesses. The most disturbing discovery came when they reached the section containing the late Queen's personal jewelry collection. This area housed pieces that held deep sentimental value beyond their monetary worth, items that had been worn at coronations, weddings, and state visits over decades were missing from their carefully maintained displays. Among the missing pieces was the Queen's favorite diamond tiara, a piece she had worn to her own wedding and had hoped to pass down to future generations. Also gone was a set of pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, items that represented centuries of royal history and tradition. These weren't just valuable objects. They were irreplaceable links to the monarchy's past. Sarah showed Thomas photographs from her investigation that confirmed his worst fears. The Queen's personal jewelry was being sold through the same underground network that had been handling the other stolen items. Security camera footage from a private auction house in Switzerland showed Edward himself delivering a small package to a man known to police as one of Europe's most notorious dealers in stolen goods. Thomas had to sit down as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Edward wasn't just stealing random valuable items. He was systematically dismantling his own family's heritage for personal profit. The financial records Sarah had obtained showed that Edward's gambling debts were even larger than anyone had suspected, and his lifestyle was completely unsustainable without additional sources of income. The detective explained that Edward had been clever about covering his tracks. He never took multiple items at once, and he always waited several weeks between visits to the vaults. The items he chose were valuable, but not immediately noticeable if missing, at least not during routine security checks. He had clearly studied the palace's security procedures and had planned his thefts to avoid detection for as long as possible. What made the situation even more complicated was the international scope of the theft ring. Sarah's investigation had revealed connections to dealers and buyers across Europe and Asia. Some of the stolen royal jewelry had already been resold multiple times and might be impossible to recover. The damage to the royal collection could be permanent, regardless of whether Edward was caught and prosecuted. Thomas knew that they now faced an impossible decision. The evidence against Prince Edward was conclusive, but arresting a member of the royal family would create a scandal that could damage the monarchy for generations. The public's trust in the royal family depended on their perceived integrity and their role as guardians of British heritage and tradition. Sarah, however, was clear about her duty as a police officer. The evidence showed that serious crimes had been committed, and she had an obligation to pursue justice regardless of who was involved. She had already prepared arrest warrants and had coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to freeze accounts and recover stolen property wherever possible. As they prepared to leave the vaults, Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He knew that he had to choose between his loyalty to the royal family and his duty to uphold the law. The evidence was undeniable, and there was no way to protect Edward without becoming complicit in his crimes. Thomas called Queen Camilla's private secretary and requested an immediate meeting with Her Majesty. The conversation would be one of the most difficult in the history of the monarchy. A mother would have to learn that her son had betrayed everything their family represented, and the royal family would have to decide how to handle a crisis that threatened to destroy their reputation forever. The investigation had revealed the truth, but the real challenge was just beginning. How do you prosecute a prince without destroying the monarchy itself? Thomas knew that by the end of the day, either justice would be served or the royal family would find a way to cover up the crimes of one of their own. Either way, nothing would ever be the same. Queen Camilla received the news in her private study, a room that had been her sanctuary since becoming queen. Thomas stood before her, his hands trembling slightly as he presented the evidence that would shatter her world. The photographs of her son meeting with known criminals, the bank records showing unexplained deposits, and most devastating of all, the images of her late mother-in-law's precious jewelry being sold at underground auctions. The Queen's face went through a series of emotions as she processed the information. First came disbelief, then confusion, and finally a deep sadness that seemed to age her before Thomas's eyes. She had always known that Edward struggled with gambling and money management, but she had never imagined he would stoop to stealing from his own family's heritage. Camilla asked to see the evidence files herself, examining each photograph and document with the careful attention of someone hoping to find some mistake or alternative explanation. She studied the security footage of Edward at the auction house, and there was no denying that it was her son. The man she had raised, protected, and defended countless times was clearly visible handling stolen royal jewelry. The Queen's first instinct was to protect her family and the monarchy. She asked Thomas about the possibility of quietly recovering the stolen items and handling the situation internally, without involving the police or the media. The royal family had weathered scandals before by managing them carefully and presenting a united front to the public. However, Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell made it clear that this approach was no longer possible. The investigation had already involved multiple international law enforcement agencies, and evidence had been shared with prosecutors in several countries. The case was too large and too public to be contained within the palace walls. Sarah explained that Edward's activities had attracted attention from financial crime, investigators who monitored unusual banking patterns and cash transactions. His name had appeared on watch lists maintained by several European police forces, and his activities were being tracked. As part of larger investigations into organized crime networks, the Queen asked about the extent of the thefts and learned that the total value of missing items exceeded £5 million. More importantly, several of the stolen pieces were considered irreplaceable historical artifacts. The late Queen's wedding tiara, in particular, had been in the royal family for over 2 centuries and represented a direct link to British royal history that could never be replicated. As the full scope of Edward's betrayal became clear, Queen Camilla made one of the most difficult decisions of her reign. She authorized the investigation to proceed, knowing that it would likely result in the arrest and prosecution of her own son. The monarchy's integrity had to be preserved, even if it meant sacrificing a member of the royal family. The Queen's decision was influenced by her understanding of public opinion and the fragile nature of the monarchy's relationship with the British people. Recent polls had shown declining support for the royal family, particularly among younger generations who questioned the relevance and cost of maintaining a hereditary monarchy in modern times. A scandal involving the theft of national treasures by a royal family member would provide ammunition for Republicans and critics who argued that the monarchy was out of touch and unworthy of public support. The only way to maintain credibility was to demonstrate that the royal family was subject to the same laws as everyone else. Thomas was instructed to coordinate with Detective Inspector Mitchell to arrange for Prince Edward's arrest. The operation would need to be handled with extreme discretion to prevent media leaks that could complicate the legal proceedings. The palace's public relations team was alerted to prepare statements that would attempt to minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation. The Queen also made the painful decision to strip Edward of his royal titles and remove him from all official duties, effective immediately. His name would be removed from the official royal website, and his apartments within the palace would be sealed as potential crime scenes. The message was clear. Edward was no longer considered a member of the royal family in any meaningful sense. As news of the impending arrest spread through the palace's inner circle, staff members who had worked with Edward for years struggled to understand how he could have betrayed the trust placed in him. Many remembered him as a charming child who had shown such promise, and they wondered how he had become someone capable of stealing from his own grandmother's memory. The investigation had also revealed that Edward had not been working alone. Analysis of security footage and financial records suggested that he had accomplices both within and outside the palace. Several staff members were now under suspicion, and additional arrests were likely to follow. Queen Camilla knew that the next few days would test the monarchy's survival in ways that previous scandals had not. The theft of royal jewelry by a prince was not just a criminal matter. It was a betrayal of the sacred trust between the royal family and the British people. The crown jewels and royal collections belonged not just to the family, but to the nation itself. As Thomas left the Queen's study to coordinate Edward's arrest, both he and the Queen understood that they were living through a historic moment that would be remembered for generations. The question was whether the monarchy would emerge stronger for having confronted the truth, or whether this scandal would mark the beginning of the end for the British royal family. Prince Edward was arrested at dawn on a Tuesday morning at his private residence in Kensington. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell led a team of plainclothes officers who surrounded the building before Edward had any chance to escape or destroy evidence. The arrest was conducted with the kind of precision usually reserved for dangerous criminals, though in this case, the target was a member of the British royal family. Edward showed no surprise when the police arrived at his door. In fact, he seemed almost relieved that his deception had finally been discovered. He had been living with the constant fear of exposure for months, and the stress had taken a visible toll on his appearance and behavior. Those close to him had noticed that he seemed nervous and distracted, but they had attributed it to his ongoing financial troubles rather than criminal activity. During the arrest, police discovered additional evidence that confirmed their suspicions about the scope of Edward's crimes. His personal safe contained detailed records of his transactions with jewelry dealers, including photographs of stolen items and notes about their historical significance and market value. It was clear that Edward had been methodical in his approach to stealing from the royal collection. The search of Edward's residence also revealed that he had been planning to steal even more valuable items. Police found floor plans of the royal vaults with specific display cases marked, suggesting that he had been planning additional thefts. Most shocking of all, they discovered that Edward had been researching the security systems protecting the crown jewels themselves, indicating that he might have been planning to target the most sacred symbols of the British monarchy. Sarah's interrogation of Edward revealed the full extent of his desperation and the pressures that had driven him to betray his family. His gambling debts had reached nearly £2 million, and he owed money to some very dangerous people who had made threats against his safety. The underground jewelry sales had initially been intended as a temporary solution, but they had quickly become addictive as Edward discovered how easy it was to convert royal treasures into cash. Edward confessed that he had started small, taking items that he thought would never be missed. A pair of earrings here, a small brooch there, pieces that were rarely displayed or worn by other family members. However, as his debts grew larger and his gambling addiction worsened, he had become bolder in his thefts, eventually targeting items with deep sentimental and historical value. The prince's confession revealed that he had not been working entirely alone. A corrupt member of the palace security staff had been providing him with information about vault inspection schedules and had helped him avoid detection during his visits. This individual had been arrested simultaneously with Edward and was facing charges of conspiracy and breach of trust. More disturbing still was Edward's admission that he had been approached by foreign agents who were interested in acquiring specific pieces from the royal collection. While he claimed to have refused these offers, the investigation suggested that he might have been providing information about the palace's security systems to individuals with connections to hostile foreign governments. The international implications of the case became clear as investigators traced the stolen jewelry through a network of dealers and buyers across Europe and Asia. Several pieces had ended up in private collections owned by wealthy individuals who claimed to have purchased them in good faith, unaware of their true origin. The process of recovering these items would be lengthy and complicated, involving diplomatic negotiations and international legal proceedings. Queen Camilla was kept informed of the investigation's progress through daily briefings from Thomas and periodic updates from the Metropolitan Police. Each new revelation about her son's activities was more painful than the last, and she struggled to reconcile the criminal, described in police reports, with the boy she had raised and loved. The Queen's biggest concern was the impact that Edward's arrest would have on the monarchy's reputation when the news inevitably became public. The royal family's communications team was working around the clock to prepare statements and responses that would minimize damage to the institution while acknowledging the seriousness of the charges against Edward. Public opinion polls conducted in the days following the arrest showed that the royal family's approval ratings had dropped to historic lows. Many British citizens felt betrayed by the idea that a prince had been stealing artifacts that belonged to the nation's heritage. The theft was seen not just as a crime against the royal family, but as an attack on British history and culture itself. The media coverage of the arrest was intense and unforgiving. Tabloid newspapers ran headlines questioning whether the royal family could be trusted to protect the nation's treasures. More serious publications raised questions about the accountability and oversight of the monarchy, with some calling for investigations into the security and management of all royal collections. Edward's arrest also triggered calls from Republican groups for the abolition of the monarchy altogether. They argued that the scandal proved that hereditary privilege was incompatible with modern democratic values and that the royal family was fundamentally corrupt and unworthy of public support. As Edward sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, he finally began to understand the full magnitude of what he had done. He had not only destroyed his own life and betrayed his family's trust, but he had potentially damaged an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years. The weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. The investigation was far from over, and more arrests were expected as police continued to unravel the network of accomplices and dealers who had facilitated Edward's crimes. The royal family braced themselves for more revelations and more damage to their reputation as the case continued to unfold. The trial of Prince Edward began 6 months later at the Central Criminal Court, known as the Old Bailey. It was the first time in modern British history that a member of the royal family had faced serious criminal charges in a public court. The media attention was unprecedented, with news organizations from around the world sending reporters to cover what many were calling the trial of the century. Edward appeared in court looking dramatically different from the confident prince the public remembered. He had lost significant weight during his time in custody, and the stress of the proceedings had aged him considerably. Gone was the expensive clothing and polished appearance that had once defined his public image. Instead, he wore a simple dark suit and appeared nervous and defeated. The prosecution, led by the Crown Prosecution Service's most experienced barrister, presented a devastating case against Edward. They had recovered security footage showing him removing items from the royal vaults, financial records proving he had received payments from known dealers in stolen goods, and testimony from accomplices who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. The evidence was so overwhelming that Edward's defense team had little choice but to argue for mitigation rather than innocence. They portrayed him as a man whose gambling addiction had driven him to desperate measures, emphasizing his cooperation with authorities and his apparent remorse for his actions. They argued that imprisonment would serve no purpose beyond satisfying public demand for punishment. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Queen Camilla herself took the witness stand. It was an unprecedented event that highlighted the extraordinary nature of the case. The Queen, dressed in black and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, described the impact of Edward's crimes on the royal family and the nation. Camilla testified about the sentimental value of the stolen items, many of which had been passed down through generations of royal family members. She spoke about the late Queen's attachment to her personal jewelry and how devastating it would have been for her to know that her own grandson had stolen pieces that represented decades of family, memories, and national history. The Queen's testimony was particularly powerful when she described the broader implications of Edward's actions. She explained how the theft had damaged public trust in the monarchy and had made it more difficult for the royal family to fulfill their ceremonial and constitutional duties. The stolen items weren't just valuable objects. They were symbols of continuity and tradition that connected the modern monarchy to centuries of British history. During cross-examination, Edward's defense attorney attempted to portray the royal family as out of touch with ordinary people's financial struggles. They suggested that Edward's crimes were partly the result of unrealistic expectations placed on him by a family that failed to provide adequate financial support for his lifestyle and obligations. This line of defense backfired spectacularly when the prosecution revealed the full extent of Edward's royal allowance and the additional financial support he had received from the family over the years. The evidence showed that Edward had been receiving more than enough money to live comfortably, and that his financial problems were entirely the result of his gambling addiction and poor decision-making. The trial also revealed new details about the international network that had facilitated the sale of stolen royal jewelry. Prosecutors showed that Edward had been in contact with dealers and buyers in at least 8 different countries, and that some of the stolen items had been specifically commissioned by wealthy collectors, who knew they were acquiring illegally obtained goods. Perhaps most damaging to Edward's case was the revelation that he had continued stealing, even after becoming aware that he was under investigation. Security footage showed him visiting the royal vaults and removing additional items, even after Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had begun her investigation. This demonstrated a level of arrogance and disregard for consequences that shocked even his own defense team. The prosecution also presented evidence that Edward had been planning even more ambitious thefts. They showed the court detailed plans he had made for accessing the crown jewels, including sketches of the security systems and notes about guard schedules. While he had never actually attempted to steal the crown jewels, the evidence of his planning demonstrated the serious threat he had posed to Britain's most sacred national treasures. Expert witnesses testified about the cultural and historical significance of the stolen items, explaining why their loss represented more than just financial damage. Art historians and royal collection curators described how each piece connected to specific moments in British history and how their theft had created gaps in the nation's cultural heritage that might never be fully repaired. The international implications of the case became clear when prosecutors revealed that several foreign governments had expressed interest in acquiring specific pieces from the royal collection. While Edward claimed he had never sold items directly to foreign agents, the evidence suggested that some of the stolen jewelry had ultimately ended up in the hands of individuals connected to hostile nations. As the trial neared its conclusion, public opinion polls showed that the majority of British citizens supported Edward's prosecution and imprisonment. Many felt that his royal status should not protect him from facing the full consequences of his actions, and there was widespread anger about his betrayal of the public trust. The case had also sparked broader discussions about the future of the monarchy and the need for greater transparency and accountability in the management of royal collections. Parliament announced plans for new legislation that would strengthen oversight of the royal family's financial affairs and create additional safeguards to protect the nation's cultural treasures. Edward's fate now rested in the hands of the jury, 12 ordinary citizens who would have to decide whether a prince should be held to the same standards of justice as everyone else. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. The courtroom was packed with reporters, royal watchers, and members of the public who had queued for hours to witness this historic moment. Prince Edward stood as the jury foreman announced the verdicts: guilty on all counts of theft, conspiracy, and money laundering. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Judge Patricia Williams, one of Britain's most respected senior judges, delivered a sentence that shocked many observers. Edward was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 8 years. The judge explained that the severity of the sentence reflected not just the financial value of the stolen items, but the breach of public trust and the damage done to British heritage. Judge Williams stated that Edward's royal status was an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one. She explained that those in positions of privilege and responsibility must be held to higher standards, not lower ones. The judge noted that Edward had violated the sacred trust placed in him as a guardian of the nation's treasures and had used his royal access to commit crimes that ordinary citizens could never have accomplished. The reaction to the verdict and sentence was swift and polarizing. Supporters of the monarchy praised Queen Camilla's decision to allow the prosecution to proceed, arguing that it demonstrated the royal family's commitment to justice and accountability. They saw the harsh sentence as necessary to restore public confidence in the monarchy and to show that no one was above the law. However, critics argued that the sentence was excessive and that Edward was being made a scapegoat for broader problems within the royal system. Some supporters of Edward claimed that his gambling addiction was a medical condition that should have been treated rather than punished, and that the royal family had failed in their duty to help him when he was clearly struggling. The international media coverage of the verdict was extensive and largely negative for the British royal family. European newspapers questioned whether the monarchy could survive such a scandal, while American media outlets drew comparisons to previous royal controversies and suggested that the institution was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Queen Camilla addressed the nation in a televised speech following the sentencing. She spoke with obvious emotion about the pain of seeing her son imprisoned, but she firmly defended the decision to allow justice to take its course. The Queen emphasized that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to uphold the rule of law and maintain the trust of the British people. The Queen's speech also addressed the broader implications of the scandal for the royal family. She announced a comprehensive review of security procedures for all royal collections and promised new measures to ensure greater transparency in the management of public assets held by the monarchy. She also committed to regular audits of royal collections and the publication of detailed inventories that would allow the public to monitor the status of important cultural artifacts. The recovery of stolen items proved to be a complex and lengthy process. International cooperation was required to trace and retrieve jewelry that had been sold across multiple countries. Some pieces were recovered within months, while others took years to locate and return. Unfortunately, several items were never recovered and were presumed to have been broken apart or permanently lost. The total cost of the investigation, trial and recovery efforts exceeded £10 million, not including the incalculable value of the lost cultural heritage. The scandal also led to significant changes in palace security and management procedures, with new oversight committees established to monitor access to royal collections and prevent future thefts. Thomas Parker, the head of the Royal Guard who had first uncovered the thefts, was promoted to a new position overseeing all palace security operations. He implemented comprehensive reforms that included enhanced background checks for staff, improved surveillance systems, and new protocols for monitoring access to sensitive areas. The changes were designed to ensure that no individual, regardless of their status, could exploit the system as Edward had done. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell received commendations for her thorough investigation and was promoted to Detective Chief Inspector. She continued to work on cases involving art and cultural heritage theft, using the experience gained from the royal jewelry case to combat similar crimes affecting museums and private collections around the world. Edward served his sentence in a medium-security prison, where he was kept in protective custody due to concerns about his safety. He participated in addiction treatment programs and reportedly showed genuine remorse for his actions. However, he remained estranged from most of his family, with only his mother maintaining occasional contact through written correspondence. The scandal marked a turning point for the British monarchy. Public opinion polls showed that while support for the institution declined initially, it gradually recovered as people appreciated the royal family's willingness to subject themselves to the same legal standards as everyone else. The transparency measures implemented following the scandal actually strengthened public confidence in the monarchy's accountability. 5 years after the trial, some of the stolen jewelry was still being recovered through ongoing international investigations. The case had created new protocols for tracking and protecting cultural heritage items globally, and it had demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in combating art and antiquities theft. The empty display cases in the royal vaults served as a permanent reminder of Edward's betrayal, but they also symbolized the monarchy's commitment to truth and justice. Queen Camilla had chosen the difficult path of exposing her family's shame, rather than covering it up, and history would judge that decision as crucial to the survival and modernization of the British royal family. The scandal of Prince Edward's theft would be remembered as one of the most serious crises ever faced by the British monarchy, but also as evidence that even ancient institutions could adapt and reform when faced with the need to maintain public trust in a democratic society.